Imagine you're sitting in a grand café somewhere in central Paris. The coffee is perfect. The architecture around you has not changed in 150 years. Everything looks stable, sophisticated, elegant. France, after all, is one of the founding pillars of the European project, the second largest economy in the Eurozone, a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, a nuclear power, a cultural empire, and yet, beneath that polished surface, something is cracking. Not loudly, not dramatically, not in the way that makes international headlines every morning, but slowly, structurally, and in ways that most analysts outside of Europe are only beginning to understand. The question is not whether France has problems. Every country has problems. The question is whether France's problems are the kind that can be managed, reformed and absorbed, or the kind that compound quietly until the system itself begins to fail. This investigation will take you inside that question. We will examine the economic architecture that holds France together, the political system that is supposed to govern it, the social pressures building beneath the surface, and the structural contradictions that have been accumulating for decades. And by the end, you will understand why some of the most serious analysts in Europe are beginning to ask a question that would have seemed absurd 10 years ago. Is France becoming a risk that Europe can no longer afford to ignore? Let us begin at the beginning. France built one of the most ambitious social contracts in modern history. After the Second World War, the French state constructed an enormous system of public services, labour protections, pension guarantees, healthcare coverage, and welfare infrastructure that became the envy of the developed world. It was a model of what a wealthy industrial democracy could achieve when it decided to take care of its citizens from birth to death. For several decades, it worked extraordinarily well. France grew, its middle class expanded, its public institutions functioned, its infrastructure was world-class, its nuclear energy program gave it cheap, reliable electricity, when the rest of Europe was dependent on coal and imported gas. The French model was not just successful, it was celebrated. But here is the first crack in the story that most people miss. The French social model was designed for an economy that no longer exists. It was designed for an era of full industrial employment, steady economic growth, stable demographics, and a global trading environment that rewarded European manufacturing. All four of those conditions have changed dramatically, and France has not fundamentally reformed its social contract to reflect that new reality. Instead, each successive government has attempted to patch the system at the edges while leaving the core architecture intact. The result is a state that spends more than any other major economy in Europe as a share of its gross domestic product, while delivering growth numbers that consistently disappoint. France's public spending as a share of its economy regularly exceeds 57%. That is not a social democratic model. That is a system in which the state dominates the economy to a degree that would be uncomfortable even by Scandinavian standards. And unlike the Scandinavian countries, France has not built the kind of flexible labour markets, export-driven industries, or trust-based institutions that make high public spending sustainable over the long term. The numbers tell the story clearly. France has not recorded a balanced budget since 1974. For 50 years, every single French government of every political colour has spent more than it has collected. The accumulated result of that half-century of deficit spending is a public debt that now exceeds 110% of gross domestic product and continues to rise. Sounds manageable, you might think. Japan has a debt ratio of over 250% and has not collapsed. Italy has been running high debt for decades. Surely France, with its strong institutions and diversified economy, can manage this. Except the comparison reveals a deeper problem, not a reassurance. Japan's debt is almost entirely held domestically. Italian institutions, for all their dysfunction, have a political culture deeply resistant to structural collapse. France, by contrast, is increasingly dependent on foreign capital markets to finance its deficit, and its political system has entered a period of instability that is making those markets increasingly nervous. And this is where the political dimension of the story begins. For most of the Fifth Republic's history, France was governed by a stable two-party system. The centre-left and the centre-right alternated in power. They disagreed on emphasis but shared a fundamental consensus about the direction of the country, the importance of European integration, the value of Atlantic alliances, and the basic structure of the French state. That consensus is gone. The 2024 French legislative elections produced something that the Fifth Republic was never designed to handle: a genuinely fragmented parliament with no dominant bloc, no stable majority, and no obvious path to coherent governance. The left-wing coalition known as the New Popular Front won the most seats but not enough to govern. Emmanuel Macron's centrist alliance collapsed from its previous dominant position into a rump coalition. and Marine Le Pen's national rally, despite being blocked from power by a last-minute tactical voting arrangement, emerged from the election stronger than it has ever been in its history, with more than 140 seats in the National Assembly. France, in other words, had elected three roughly equal blocs that are fundamentally incompatible with each other. You might think this sounds like politics. Every democracy has difficult elections. Coalitions are formed, compromises are made, governments function, except the French constitutional system was not designed for coalition politics. The Fifth Republic was created by Charles de Gaulle in 1958 specifically to avoid the instability of the Fourth Republic, which had gone through 21 governments in 12 years. De Gaulle's solution was to concentrate executive power in the presidency, create a strong government with the authority to push legislation through Parliament, and design a two-round electoral system that naturally favoured large centrist blocs over fragmented minorities. For 60 years that design worked. It produced stable governments. It allowed France to make long-term economic decisions, build institutions and project power internationally. But the design assumed something that is no longer true. It assumed that French voters would continue to organise themselves into two broad competing camps, and they have stopped doing that entirely. What France has instead is a three-way political fracture that its constitutional machinery cannot process cleanly. And the consequences of that fracture are beginning to show in ways that should concern anyone watching European stability. But the political fracture is only one layer of the problem. Beneath it lies something older, deeper, and harder to fix. France has a structural economic problem that successive governments have been unable to solve and largely unwilling to fully acknowledge. The problem is not unique to France. It is a version of the challenge facing all mature welfare states in an era of slower growth and ageing populations. But France's version of the problem is particularly severe because the French political system makes reform extraordinarily difficult. Consider the pension crisis. In 2023, Emmanuel Macron pushed through a reform raising the retirement age from 62 to 64. It was a modest change by international standards. Germany's retirement age is 67. The United Kingdom's is moving towards 67 as well. Even within Europe, 64 is not a radical number, yet the reform triggered the largest and most sustained wave of street protests France had seen in decades. Millions of people took to the streets across the country over multiple months. Garbage piled up in Paris as sanitation workers joined the strikes. Oil refineries were blockaded. Transportation was repeatedly disrupted, and Macron ultimately had to use a constitutional provision allowing him to bypass parliamentary approval entirely, a move that itself triggered a constitutional crisis and a failed no-confidence vote. The episode illustrated something fundamental about the French political landscape. The French public has an extremely strong attachment to the welfare state as it currently exists, combined with a profound distrust of any government that attempts to modify it. This is not irrationality. It is a rational response from a population that watched decades of neoliberal reform in other countries produce rising inequality, precarious employment, and hollowed-out communities, and decided that the French model was worth defending. But it creates a political trap. The French model is financially unsustainable without reform. Reform is politically impossible without triggering social explosions that destabilize the government, and the governments that emerge from those social explosions are often weaker and more constrained than the governments that entered them. This is the loop France has been caught in for 20 years, and there is no obvious exit. Yet even this only scratches the surface of the underlying tension. France has a geography problem that rarely appears in economic analyses but shapes everything else about the country's politics. The France that international observers see, the Paris of grand boulevards, the world-class museums, the Michelin-starred restaurants, the thriving luxury goods industry, the major technology investments, is not the France that most French people actually live in. The real France is divided between a small number of major metropolitan areas that are integrated into the global economy and doing relatively well, and a vast hinterland of medium-sized towns, rural communities, and post-industrial zones that have been largely left behind by the economic transformations of the past 30 years. This is the France of the Gilets jaunes, the Yellow Vest movement that erupted in 2018 and shocked the French establishment. The movement began as a protest against fuel taxes, but rapidly expanded into a broader expression of rage from people who felt economically marginalised, geographically excluded, and politically invisible. People who drove long distances to work because they could not afford to live in the cities. People whose local hospitals had been closed, whose train stations had been shuttered, whose town centres had been hollowed out by the closure of factories and shops. The Gilets jaunes were not organised by any political party. They had no central leadership, no formal programme, no coherent ideology. What they had was a shared sense that the France being managed from Paris was not their France, and that nobody in the political mainstream was speaking to their reality. That feeling has not gone away. It has been absorbed into the broader radicalization of French politics, feeding both the hard left and the hard right simultaneously, and making the centre increasingly difficult to hold. And here is where the European dimension of the story becomes critical. France is not just a country with domestic problems. France is one of the two foundational pillars of the European Union, alongside Germany. The entire architecture of European integration was built on the assumption of a stable, functional, reform-capable France, working in close partnership with a stable, export-driven Germany to provide the political and economic backbone of the continental project. Both pillars are now weakening at the same time. Germany's economy has entered a period of genuine structural difficulty, squeezed between the collapse of its cheap Russian gas supply, the competitive pressure from China's industrial rise, the transition costs of the green energy transformation, and a political system that has produced a series of unstable coalition governments struggling to make long-term decisions. France, meanwhile, is contributing its own set of instabilities. Its fiscal trajectory is diverging from the path that European budget rules require. Its political system is producing governments without stable majorities. Its social tensions are generating periodic eruptions that alarm markets and partners alike. And its ability to play the traditional French role of driving European political integration forward is being constrained by a domestic situation that demands increasing attention and energy. The timing could hardly be worse. Europe is facing a set of external challenges that require exactly the kind of decisive, coordinated, sustained response that a weakened Franco-German axis is poorly positioned to provide. The war in Ukraine has fundamentally altered the security environment. The relationship with the United States is increasingly uncertain. The competition with China is intensifying across technology, trade, and geopolitical influence, and the green energy transition is creating enormous economic disruption that needs to be managed across 27 member states with very different economic structures and political cultures. All of these challenges require a strong, functional core of European leadership, and the core is fraying. What makes the French situation particularly acute is the role of Marine Le Pen and the National Rally in the country's political future. The National Rally has travelled a long distance from its origins as the Front National, the explicitly racist, anti-Semitic and nostalgic party founded by Jean-Marie Le Pen in the 1970s. Under Marine Le Pen's leadership, the party has undergone what she calls a process of de-diabolization, the systematic softening of its most extreme positions, the cultivation of a more mainstream image, and the deliberate targeting of working-class and lower-middle-class voters who feel abandoned by the traditional parties. The strategy has been extraordinarily successful. In the 2022 presidential election, Marine Le Pen received 41.8% of the vote in the second round, the strongest performance by a far-right candidate in French Republican history. In the 2024 legislative elections, the National Rally and its allies won more than 10 million votes in the first round, making it the single most popular political force in France. The party has not yet taken power. It has been blocked each time by a coalition of other parties uniting against it, the so-called Republican Front. But the Republican Front is becoming more fragile with each election cycle. The parties that form it are increasingly reluctant to sacrifice their own voters and supporters in order to stop the National Rally, especially when doing so produces governments that are weak, unstable, and incapable of addressing the underlying grievances that drive people toward the National Rally in the first place. The question facing France, and facing Europe, is not whether the National Rally can be stopped forever. The question is what happens to French and European politics if and when it is not. A National Rally government in France would represent the most significant shift in European political alignment since the end of the Cold War. The party's traditional positions have included skepticism toward European integration, hostility toward NATO, sympathy for Russia, and a vision of French sovereignty that is fundamentally incompatible with the current architecture of the European Union. While Marine Le Pen has moderated some of these positions in her public statements, the core instincts of the movement remain, and they would shape any government it formed. The European Union has already demonstrated in its confrontations with Hungary and Poland that it has limited tools for dealing with member states whose governments systematically undermine the values and rules of the European project. Hungary and Poland are medium-sized economies on the eastern periphery of Europe. France is the second largest economy in the Eurozone and a co-founder of the entire project. The EU has no mechanism for handling a France that decides to stop playing by the rules, but even short of a National Rally government, the trajectory of French politics is creating problems that compound over time. Each election that produces a hung parliament makes governance harder. Each failed reform deepens the fiscal gap. Each social explosion weakens the government's political capital. Each year that passes without addressing the structural economic problems makes those problems more expensive to solve, and each cycle of political instability makes investors and partners slightly more cautious about France's long-term reliability. Markets have already begun to notice. In 2024, the spread between French and German 10-year government bond yields, a measure of how much extra interest investors demand to lend to France rather than Germany, widened to its highest level in more than a decade. At certain points, investors were demanding higher returns to lend to France than to Spain, a country that had required a major European bailout during the sovereign debt crisis of 2011 and 2012. This is a remarkable development. France is one of the richest, most institutionally developed, most economically sophisticated countries in the world. That bond markets are pricing it as a riskier borrower than countries it once looked down upon with barely concealed condescension is a signal that something structural has shifted in how sophisticated investors assess French political economy. The French government's own fiscal projections tell a story that makes those bond market signals understandable. The budget deficit is running at around 6% of gross domestic product, double the limit required by European Union fiscal rules. The debt ratio is rising. The government has been forced to implement emergency austerity measures that are politically unpopular and economically contractionary at the same time, and the political conditions for the kind of comprehensive fiscal reform that would actually stabilise the trajectory do not currently exist. This creates a slow-moving spiral that is easy to dismiss as manageable, right up until the point where it is not. France is not Greece. It cannot be allowed to default. It is too large, too central, too systemically important. If France were to face a genuine debt crisis, the European Central Bank and the European stability mechanisms would intervene massively to prevent it. The Eurozone cannot survive a French fiscal collapse, but that is precisely what makes the situation dangerous in a different way. The knowledge that France is too important to be allowed to fail reduces the urgency of the reforms that would prevent a crisis in the first place. It creates a moral hazard at the heart of European fiscal governance, and it means that the pressure for reform must come from somewhere other than the financial markets, from European institutions, from political will, from genuine domestic consensus, none of which are currently strong enough to do the job. So where does France go from here? The honest answer is that nobody knows. France has surprised pessimists before. The country has a long history of dramatic crises followed by equally dramatic recoveries. The French state, for all its inefficiencies, retains enormous institutional capacity. French society, for all its tensions, retains deep reserves of civic solidarity when genuinely threatened. And the French economy, for all its structural problems, remains one of the most sophisticated and diversified in the world. It is possible that France will find a political path through its current fragmentation, a new political figure, a new coalition, a new consensus that manages to address the fiscal reality without triggering social explosion. It has happened before. Charles de Gaulle did it in 1958, transforming a country on the verge of civil war into a functioning republic in the space of a few years. Subsequent leaders managed major transformations that seemed impossible until they happened, but it is also possible that France is entering a prolonged period of political paralysis and fiscal drift, sustained by the implicit guarantee of European support, unable to reform but also unable to collapse, mudding through decade after decade while the structural problems accumulate and the political temperature rises and the distance between the France of Paris and the France of everywhere else continues to widen. And if that second scenario plays out, not a dramatic collapse but a slow, grinding erosion, the consequences for Europe would be profound. An EU without an effective France is an EU without its political engine. The European project was built on the idea that France and Germany would drive integration forward, that their partnership would provide the political will and the institutional creativity to keep building something larger than either country could be alone. Remove France from that equation, not through catastrophe but through dysfunction, and you are left with a European Union that is less able to act, less able to reform, less able to compete on the global stage, and less able to defend its values and interests in a world that is becoming more competitive and more dangerous. That is the real stakes of the French situation. Not the budget deficit by itself, not the fragmented parliament by itself, not Marine Le Pen by herself, but the combination of all these pressures converging in a country that cannot afford to be distracted, in a moment when Europe cannot afford to lose its second pillar. The café in Paris still looks beautiful. The coffee is still perfect. The architecture has not changed, but the foundations beneath it are shifting. And whether France and Europe can stabilise those foundations before the cracks become something more visible is one of the defining questions of this decade. The Fifth Republic has survived before. The question is whether it has ever faced quite this combination of pressures, at quite this speed, with quite this little political room to manoeuvre. The answer to that question will shape not just France, it will shape Europe, and in shaping Europe, it will shape the world.